The lesson today comes from the book of Exodus once again, this time chapter 32. It's probably one of those stories that you know, but I hope you'll listen with fresh ears as we explore it together. It's the episode of the golden calf. And while the reading actually is the first 14 verses of the chapter, I'm just going to read a couple from the middle because the rest of the story will be told as part of the sermon. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" This is the word of God for the people of God. Beverly and I spent the last couple of days down in Alexandria, Virginia with our new granddaughter. And one of the things that we're discovering about Misha is that she is particularly vocal. Now, I don't say that meaning that she's one of those screaming, crying babies like you get with colic. She just likes to have her mouth going. She makes a lot of little cooing sounds, and she, forms words in her own mind, I suppose. And she does cry a little bit, like in the whimpering sense. So you aren't always sure what she wants, but pretty much she's just kind of sharing like the rest of us talk. She likes to hear herself talk, I guess. Not very often, but occasionally, she'll find one of those moments where she decides she's done talking. And in fact, she's okay with just being alone. And so on those rare occasions, we put her down in the playpen, and she can just kind of look up at the stars that are hanging from the mobile and entertain herself temporarily. Well, Saturday morning, we had one of those brief times, just about the time of brunch. And so we're sitting there eating, and she's in the other room quietly studying those hangy stars. And it must have been 10, maybe 12 minutes at most. And all of a sudden, we heard the voice. But it was kind of an agitated sounding voice, the kind that tells mom she needs to go check. And so Lizzie got up and went in and checked on her. But as soon as she saw mom and heard mom's voice, she just kind of went back to studying those stars for a little while longer. So Lizzie was able to come back and finish her breakfast, which she doesn't usually get to do. And after a minute or so, I said to everybody, I think what happened there was Misha must have looked around all of a sudden and discovered that she was the only one in the room. And I think she got a little uncomfortable, a little nervous, a little scared, like maybe she wondered if she'd been abandoned, if we all disappeared on her. She just needed to be reassured. I think that's what was going on with Israel as they stood at the foot of Mount Sinai that day. Now remember, it's really been less than 2 months to this point since they left Egypt. They've witnessed some of the most tremendous acts of divine power that have ever been witnessed on earth. They've seen the plagues fall upon Egypt. They've seen the parting of the Red Sea and a few other things as well. They know, or at least they should know, the power of their God. And for the last several days or weeks, they've actually seen visual evidence of that power at the top of the mountain. A dark cloud and thunder and lightning and earthquakes and wild fiery images and stuff like that. It's not like God hadn't made himself known. A little bit before this, God had called Moses up onto the mountain and had given him the law, the rules for the relationship between Israel and their God, and had offered this covenant relationship to the people. So he sent Moses back down the mountain, and Moses presented it all to the people, and the people said, "Yes, we're for it. We want to be in this special relationship with God. And we will follow the instructions that he has laid out for how to relate to him." And then God called Moses back up the mountain. Now, we're told that he was up there for 40 days and 40 nights. What isn't clear, to me anyway, is whether the people knew ahead of time how long he was going to be up there. In fact, I would strongly suspect that they didn't understand how long he was going to be up there. I'm not even sure Moses knew how long he was going to be up there. But as the time wore on, and as these visuals continued to happen on the mountain, you can understand why the people would start to wonder. I wonder if Moses is okay. And the longer time wore on, the more they began to entertain the thought that maybe Moses wasn't coming back. Maybe he died up there. And so they gather around Aaron, Moses' brother, who is serving as the high priest. And they say, "Aaron, make for us gods to go before us. For this Moses character, this man who led us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him." Now, one of the difficulties that we have with this passage is that the name God, when we refer to God as God rather than Yahweh, most of the time, the vast majority of the time in the Old Testament, the word is Elohim, which is a plural word, a word that normally means gods. And that is the word that the people use here. Make for us gods to go before us. So we're left in a bit of a quandary. Do we read this as plural gods, or do we read it as a singular? They could have said this. They could have said, "Make gods for us to go before us." Might also be that they said, "Make for us a God to go before us." It might also be that they said, "Make God," as in Yahweh, "for us." It's not clear. My suspicion, based on Aaron's reaction, is that they were looking for some kind of visual representation of Yahweh, the God of Israel. But I can't be sure. I can't be sure. The only thing I can be sure of is what they were thinking about and how Aaron responded. And remember, what they're thinking about is like Misha lying there in her playpen. They were pretty sure they'd been abandoned. Now, how far that went, we don't know. Did they think that God had abandoned them? It kind of looks that way. It kind of looks like even though they've seen all this great stuff and all this evidence that God is for them and helping them and on their side, they think with Moses gone, maybe God's gone. But as I said, we do know for sure what Aaron thought. Aaron told them, gather in all the gold rings and earrings that are in the camp. And he melted them down probably. And then somehow fashioned them where it's not really clear how he did it, but he fashioned that molten gold into a calf. And that calf, in Aaron's mind anyway, represented God. He presents the calf, and the people shout the same thing that they said when they asked for this in the first place. These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Because they say who brought you up out of Egypt, it seems likely that they mean this is God who brought you up out of Egypt. Aaron for certain thinks that because he says tomorrow will be a feast to the Lord. And that's exactly what they did. The next morning they got up, they made sacrifices, they worshiped, they ate and drank, and they had a good time. I find it difficult to put a lot of blame on Israel. I would like to think that I'm strong enough in the faith. I'd like to fool myself into thinking I'm strong enough in the faith that if I came to the foot of Sinai and was left alone for 40 days, I could still hang on and believe God was still in control. But it seems an awful lot like this is a normal human reaction. Yet we know that they did wrong because God says to Moses, your people have acted perversely. Well, first of all, what did they do? They broke the second commandment. It's not a question of having gods before God. It's a question of making a graven image. And one of the things that goes along with that and that we often kind of look past is that he says, don't make a graven image of anything in the heavens. What's the primary thing that we find in the heavens? God. Don't make a representation even of me, God is saying. God exists in mystery. God cannot be represented by anything that's in creation. And now the people have done just that. They've tried to represent his presence by this calf. And there are a lot of reasons why they might have chosen a calf. None of that's important. What matters is they were scared. And they wanted to know God was with them. Kind of reminds me of that story of the little girl who's getting ready for bed, and her dad puts her into bed and tucks her in, and he kisses her goodnight and walks out of the room, turns out the light. And a couple of seconds later, she yells, "Daddy! Daddy! Come back!" Comes back in, sits down next to her. "What's wrong?" "I'm scared. I need you to stay here." "But honey, you're just fine, and I'm just outside the room. But I want somebody with me." "Well, God is with you, but I can't see God. I want somebody here with skin on." You ever hear that story? I want somebody here with skin on. They needed a physical reassurance, and without Moses, that physical reassurance wasn't there. But what they had done by creating this calf, despite the legitimacy or not of their motivation, what they had done was they had brought the God who is mystery into a physical, compressed box, if you will, that they now had control over. They were in control of God's presence. In a very real sense, this was the sin of the garden repeated. God had just gotten through telling them the conditions under which they were to relate to him. The rules and the expectations by which to relate to and to follow and to worship him. And even at that moment, he was instructing Moses on how to put the tabernacle together so that they would have the right place to worship. But instead, they chose to jump the gun and make God present to them themselves. In the garden, Adam and Eve had been planted there and given a very clear outline of how to relate to God. And it was simple. Supremely simple. Just don't eat from that tree. And everything's kosher. But instead they chose to do it their own way. Remember a number of years back there was this very well-known and very influential daytime talk show host. And she would, every once in a while, start to have a discussion about something related to the church. She claimed faith, but there were a few things that she took issue with in terms of the historic, traditional, biblical, orthodox teachings of the church. And when she would tackle these issues, she would always conclude with something like this: my God would never do that. My God would never say that. My God would never look at things that way. See, she was creating a God in her own image. She was creating a God that she could control. Frighteningly and sadly, there were a number of Christians who latched on to what she had to say, too. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, she wanted to control the one who is beyond control. And that's what Israel was doing. Israel wanted to set the terms. But God has made it clear that we relate to him and worship him only on his terms. So what is this really about? I think it's about trust. I think it's about faith. Of all people, don't you think Israel should have at least been able to give God the benefit of the doubt, if not full trust? They had just crossed the Red Sea. Come on! Surely they knew that God was on their side. And that God was more than capable of caring for them. And that God actually thought a lot of them, loved them, in fact. But they didn't trust him enough to wait. And I think it's interesting. Somebody pointed this out in something I read this week. One of the most common synonyms for faith in the Old Testament is wait or waiting. We're called over and over again to wait on the Lord. Wait for the Lord. Wait upon the Lord. That means to trust him enough to let God do what God's going to do according to God's will and according to God's wisdom. Not to try to jump ahead, but to trust God. Ultimately, Israel did not trust the God who had just freed them from captivity. And so they sought to find their own security, to make their own way, to make their own God in their own image. How do you do that?